I'm officially unmuted. I just want to welcome everyone and thank you for joining us for the third virtual Captain's Circle gathering this fall. And just want to let you know that this evening we'll have a presentation by our board president, John Morris. It'll be about 45 minutes, and hopefully we'll be sort of winding it up around 7 o'clock. And if you have questions, as Betsy was saying, you can enter them in the chat box or raise your hand or, just unmute yourselves. In any event, I have the pleasure of introducing to you our board president, John Morris. And John is the grandson of the Swedish Gloucester doryman, Steve Olsson, who was lost at sea in 1935. John holds a B.A. from Boston University and a master's in social work and a Ph.D. from Brandeis University, their Heller School. He's the, are we still here? Oh yes, okay. Yes, he's the Director Emeritus of the Marcus Institute for Aging Research at the Hebrew Senior Life Center in Boston, and he's very widely published in that field. He's been the president of the event board since 2011, and John, with fellow board members, completed the campaign to finish the vessel and get her back to sea. His book, Alone at Sea, is really an authoritative fishing history of Gloucester. It's got a foreword by Joe Garland, and I highly recommend that folks, grab a copy of it and read it this fall and winter. Sit by the fire, the stove, and I can guarantee you'll kiss the ground you're walking on once you read the accounts that folks had to endure out there in the part of the world. So in any event, I welcome you, and I have the pleasure of turning it over to John for the duration of the evening. Thank you, John.
Thank you. I hope you can hear me, Betsy. Is that correct?
Yes, can.
Yeah, so I'm going to tell you about the schooner races. It's an apropos time to do it. The first schooner race with the Nova Scotians was 100 years ago. 100 years ago, this November 1st, which is also my birthday. So this is Alone at Sea. Comes from my book. So let me get going. So it's over 100 years since the schooner Esperanto first sailed north to Nova Scotia to meet the Lunenburg champion Delawana. To most, this great race raised romantic images of majestic schooners and hardy fishermen. But to understand the 1920 race, one needs a firm grounding in the economic reality of the fisheries of that day. Our story thus begins not in 1920, but in the mid-1860s, going back to the time when Gloucester first became the premier North American. This position rested on the schooner, the dory, and the abundant groundfish on the offshore grounds that spread from Cape Cod to Newfoundland. Schooners went to sea with ice and salt to preserve the catch, herring and mackerel to be used as bait. The Essex and Gloucester shipyards launched a superior class of schooners, called in those days things like sharpshooters and clippers. Clippers had sleek hulls, shell drafts, tall masts, elongated spars, and an immense sail area. And these vessels would undergo a revolution in the decades that followed. If you go to Schooner Adventure, you're going to see the end of that revolution. She represents sort of the pinnacle of schooner design. These vessels slide through the sea in an immense coat of canvas, reaching the grounds in record times. In the mid-1860s, dory-based groundfall trawl fishing first came to the schooners, and together they laid the foundation for Gloucester's prosperity up to the time of the 1920 International Schooner Race. On the grounds, the men went out in small 13 to 18-foot dories. A schooner in the 1860s would launch 6 to 8 of these two-man dories, and later 12 to even 14 such dories over many miles of open ocean. The two men in each dory laid long ground lines containing hundreds of baited hooks on the seafed below. Once laying, the men waited 30 to 60 minutes for the skipper's command to retrieve the trawl. Once given, the bowman used the swells to help him pull up the trawl line. When the dory rose, he held the ground line fast. When the dory fell between the swells, he held the ground line as fast as possible. As the fish came up, the men in the stern developed a rhythm for taking off the fish and handling the line. When the storage area in the middle of the dory was filled, the men headed back to the schooner. On a good day, a dory could land upwards to 1,000 to 2,000 pounds of cod, haddock, hake, or halibut. On reaching the schooner, the men threw the bow and stern painters onto the deck, moving the fish from the dory to the schooner. This fishery would sustain the city from 1860s into the turbulent years of World War I. War brought inflation and great prosperity. Gloucester's total catch rose from 70 million pounds in 1913 to over doubling it to 144 million pounds of fish in 1918. With war's end, though, America no longer had a huge army to feed, and Gloucester's fish firms held huge stockpiles of unsold processed fish. During the war, Gordon Pugh had seen its sales volume rise from $3 million in 1916 to over $9 million in 1918. But in 1919, the firm was unsure of how best to move forward. Military contracts had been ended, and for most of the year, Gordon Pugh looked for ways to sell its enormous inventory of processed fish to the civilian population. As 1920 opened, a sense of uncertainty hung over the community. Domestic markets were falling and local warehouses were bursting with last year's catch. Outfitters showed little interest in sending their schooners on extended trips to the Scotian and Grand Banks. And after the annual Lenten boom, fresh fish prices dropped to pre-war levels. In Lunenburg, Nova Scotia, as the Canadian schooners returned from their year's first salt bank trip, they too found little demand for their catch. International demand was on the wane, and many saw little justification in continuing to send craft to sea. It was in this climate that the Halifax business community looked for a strategy to put Canadian fish back on the international map. The local newspaper suggested sponsoring a schooner race to decide the best Canadian vessel. Vessel against vessel, these old majestic schooners, crewed by seasoned fishermen, would vie for top honors. The national and American papers were sure to pick it up. People would pay attention to the Canadian fisheries. Within weeks, the Halifax community had subscribed $2,240 in prize money to the winner of the race. The race was now assured. There was even talk of a 1921 match race between the best of the Nova Scotian fleet and the best of the New England fleet. But the men in Gloucester, they couldn't wait until 1921. The Gloucester fisheries were in shambles, and out of the blue, Gloucester accepted the challenge, not in 21, but in 1920. The fishermen of Gloucester wished to compete in the fall, and H.R. Silver of the Halifax Herald, head of the Nova Scotia Race Committee, jumped at the offer. What better way to increase visibility than to include the Gloucestermen? The excitement within the business and fishing communities of Lunenburg, Halifax, and Gloucester was soon catching. In the blink of an eye, Gloucester had its own racing committee. Meanwhile, in Nova Scotia, of the more than 120 Lunenburg schooners, 9 came forward to sail for the Canadian National Trophy and prize money. The winner would have the honor of representing Nova Scotia in the match race with the New England Challenger. They held the race off of Halifax in a moderate breeze of wind. The salt bankers sailed with the wind over the first half of the 40-mile course, averaging 10 1/4 knots. They sailed against the wind on the second half of the course, with the eventual winner, the schooner Delawana, averaging 7 1/2 knots over the full 40-mile course. She was a beautiful vessel, a worthy Canadian champion, and Nova Scotians were certain she could beat any craft put up by the New Englanders. In Gloucester, the local racing committee looked for a vessel to carry the American banner. Time was short, and in these hard times, some in Gloucester wondered whether any of the local firms who owned most of the vessels would step forward with a boat. And even if they did, how could the local community afford to prepare? Betsy, you're way ahead of me. Go back. You're way ahead of me. You skipped the race. Go back. And even if they did, how could the local community afford to prepare here for the race? There was no time to raise the money. Silver from Halifax sent word to Gloucester, seeking confirmation the town meant business. If so, representatives of the Halifax committee were ready to address all the details. Silver called for the race to be held off of Halifax and promised that future races would alternate between Halifax and Cape Ann. This was not to be a one-time race, but the beginning of a series of international races. Fortunately for Gloucester, a man named Benjamin A. Smith, who was a principal of the Garland Fishery Company, had caught the racing bug. At the end of the first week of October, when the Garland vessel Esperanto returned from a saltbank trip, Smith simply announced she was to carry the colors of Gloucester and America to Halifax. Garland would take full responsibility for fitting out the vessel. There was to be no local competition, only the Esperanto, and the men along the waterfront were proud to send her north for the competition. Esperanto was a real fisherman. Her pedigree was unquestioned. She had been launched in Essex in 1906. She was 107.4 feet long at the waterline, and she was measured at 140 tons. Although not the fastest of the Gloucester fleet, knowledgeable fishermen felt she could take Delawana. She was built for speed and had shown her mettle in all conditions. The owners of Delawana had built her along similar lines, but she was newer by 7 years. She had been built in Lunenburg in 1913. She was 106 feet at the waterline, and she had a measurement of 124 gross tons. Her whole career had been in the salt cod fishery, which was the fishery if you were in Lunenburg. The Esperanto, after unloading her 150,000-pound salt cod cargo, lay at the Garland D.P. Smith Wharf, which, by the way, is right down from maritime Gloucester, showing all the signs of a hard season at sea. When Captain Marty Welch of the schooner Thelma came over to inspect her, he found a craft in need of repair, and his opinion mattered. Captain Welch would skipper Esperanto in the race, and Marty was a seasoned master mariner, and there had been general praise for his selection. Interest in the race grew daily. Everyone had an opinion on its outcome. Some doubted the ability of Esperanto to cope with a Nova Scotian defender. Others felt Esperanto would make it a runaway if there was a breeze. That assumed that Garland could get her in shape for the race, scheduled to begin on November 1st off Halifax. The winner was to get $4,000, the other vessel was to get $1,000. People crowded the waterfront to look over the local contender. The watchword of the day became, "Where's this Esperanto? Let's go have a look at Esperanto." Curious people were everywhere. People were taking notice in Nova Scotia, in New England, and across America. It was in the papers. 2 true fishing schooners with seasoned fishermen were about to compete. Garland threw its men into fitting out the contender. They put in long hours cleaning up Esperanto and stowing 85 tons of pig iron in the bowels for ballast. She was taken to the Parkhurst Railway, which is where the Coast Guard is right now. She was hauled, cleaned, and her sides scraped and painted. She then returned to the D.B. Smith Wharf, where they put on her main topmast, while the men in the spar yard in Harbor Cove shaped a new rough stick for her foretopmast, and others overhauled the steering machinery. As the activities began to come to a close, riggers hoisted the new foretopmast and bent on the sails. On the day Esperanto was to sail, skippers, fishermen, families, and just plain well-wishers came to say Godspeed. Motorboats flitted about her. There was a mighty roar as the craft started on her way. The oldest residents of the city could not remember anything that rivaled the lively scene and enthusiasm. Foghorns bellowed a goodbye until Esperanto passed down the harbor. At Eastern Point, a cannon boomed a final salute as Esperanto dropped below the horizon. On reaching Halifax, Captain Welch told the reporters, including those who had come up from Gloucester with him on the vessel, of the grand send-off and of his uneventful trip up the coast. After signing on a pilot, Captain Welch sailed Esperanto on a trial run over the Halifax course. Welch found the Esperanto a hard vessel to put in trim. Her usual skipper, a man named Captain Charlie Hardy, said Esperanto was a funny vessel, sailing by the head a little bit. Known as an ordinary vessel, she was good in the wind. As the competition unfolded, real-time updates came in at Gloucester's Western Union office. Hundreds of people surrounded the office as the manager posted bulletins on a blackboard on the window. In race one, the last note said it all. Esperanto wins, first race in Fisherman Series. Leads Nova Scotia Hope by 20 minutes over the finish line. It was an enormous victory. Esperanto was started 27 seconds behind Delawana, but led by over 3 minutes at the first mark and doubled her lead by the shut-in buoy mark. And as the wind blew from the west, Esperanto made it a runaway. For race two, the crowd gathered once more at the Western Union office to learn the fate of Esperanto. The race opened with a slight wind. It picked up as the race wore on. Delawana crossed the starting line a few lengths ahead of Esperanto, maintained a half-mile lead at the shut-in on Island buoy mark. The Nova Scotians had redone her ballast after race one. They had taken ballast out, and she was sure with lighter ballast on the vessel, she would do well in the current wind conditions. As word of the race came over the wires, Gloucester people first stood in silence. Esperanto was losing. At 2 o'clock, Delawana had opened up a 12-length lead. At 2:10, both vessels were headed to the windward of the inner buoy, and relative positions were unchanged. At 2:30, Esperanto had caught up to Delawana and was passing through her lee. At 2:35, Delawana was again in the lead, but by only 3 lengths. Esperanto had hauled in her sheets and was trying for Delawana's weather, blocking her wind. At 2:40, the two skippers were said to be in a game of one-upsmanship. One message stating, Esperanto, now in the lead, was followed by another saying, Delawana, now in the lead. At 2:42, Esperanto had again moved to a half-length lead. At 2:50, Captain Himmelin of Delawana had his bowsprit ahead of Captain Welch's foremast. Then at 3:13, word came that Esperanto had rounded the inner buoy 30 seconds behind. With the wind holding, both craft were making over 7 knots. It would be a long tack, followed by a short tack up the harbor. But it was Esperanto that made the better tacks. She crossed the finish line a few lengths ahead of Delawana, just as the sky let loose a downpour of rain. It was close, just the type of contest the fishermen had hoped for. In Gloucester, Ben Smith received the message confirming Esperanto win, and he telephoned the Gloucester Cold Storage with 3 words, blow your whistle. The whistle was sounded and its message reinforced by the boats in the harbor and the firms on shore. The crowd at the Western Union office poured into the street, spreading news of the glorious win. Children who had just left school joined in the noisy festivities. They fell in with the fishermen and the people of the city who were dancing in the streets. The demonstration went on for more than an hour, and mischievous children kept it up well into the evening. Esperanto arrived back in Gloucester 5 days later at 2 o'clock in the morning, the winds having held her up on the trip south. The streets were quiet. Only a half dozen people were out as she came up the harbor and tied up at the Parkhurst Wharf. Later that morning, the tug Eveleth towed her out of the harbor, thereby permitting a heroic return before all the people of Cape Ann. From her masthead flowed not only the stars and stripe, but a broom, the latter symbolizing her victory over Delawana. Multicolored signifiers flied from her rigging, fore and aft, from the topmast to the end of the booms and to the tip of the bowsprit. At 2:25, in the middle of a beautiful day, the fire alarm signal belched forth a long blast, followed by whistles and bells around the waterfront. In an instant, the greatest crowd that had ever gathered on a Gloucester wharf swarmed down to pews and the harbor front. Schools were let out, and the youth of the city streamed toward the harbor. Thousands gathered on the wharf as the tug pushed the Esperanto into berth, and people soon swarmed over the vessel. From stem to stern, a babble of voices filled the air as people greeted the crew and the owners. That evening, the city staged a banquet for 700 people at the State Armory, followed by a gathering at the movie house to see the pictures of the race. Several hundred people attended, including the crew. The Esperanto had run a true fisherman's race. This might be a changing world. Powered vessels had come into their own, but Gloucester and America could still once more appreciate the worth of the men of Dory's salt banker, manning a vessel under sail. And years to come, as the fishermen of Gloucester look back on this contest and the ones that were to follow, there was no question this was the best. It represented the high watermark of the international contest. But most important, it was a true fisherman's race. No one argued about gear or tactics on the course, nor are the vessels designed newly for the competition. Great honor fell to these two craft and their crews. Lunenburg, Gloucester, they had done themselves proud, and the business interests of both communities basked in the momentary exposure. I think, as you can tell from the praise I just gave to this race, the races that followed were all flawed in one way or another. I'm going to bring you through the next two races, and there were more that followed that, with the coming into the scene of the schooners Bluenose, Mayflower, Elsie, Puritan, and Henry Ford. But remember my statement, my view. There was only to be one true fisherman's race, and Esperanto had come out the winner. Given the commercial aim of the race, as the thrill of victory passed, the fishermen in the South came to realize that nothing had really changed. The grand spectacle had not insulated the fisheries from the economic woes engulfing North America and the Depression following World War I. Gloucester's total catch tumbled from 120 million pounds in 1919 to 75 million pounds in 1920. Prices, wages fell. International markets remained unpredictable. Fish stocks and warehouses remained high. The situation was no different in the provinces. In Newfoundland, the government stepped in to buy large quantities of unsold codfish to lessen the blow to the fishermen. It was in this climate that Lunenburg, Nova Scotia sent word that a new schooner would enter the fleet, the Bluenose. Designed near the limits of the size and other criteria specified in the Halifax deed of gift for the race, the Nova Scotians were confident that she would claim the International Cup for Canada. They had been astonished by Delawana's loss to Esperanto. And in late November, Manfred Smith and Rulon Shipyard had already selected the best timber to frame and plank the new schooner. Mid-December saw her keel laid, and the people of Lunenburg talked incessantly of Bluenose. If Gloucester had the best of the old line schooners, Lunenburg would have the best of the first of the racing fishing schooners. And in Gloucester, although there was talk of a possible new racing fisherman later in the fall of 1921, it was a distant hope. This was not a good time to raise the needed capital. The fishing interests of Gloucester were 1 year away from investing in new vessels, Ford and Puritan. Gloucester felt that her oldest bank schooners would contest one another in a trial race off Cape Ann and then sail north to vie with the Nova Scotia new racing fishermen, who they assumed would race the runoff race up there. But in Boston, of all places, there were those of a different mind. And on December 10th, 1920, a group calling itself the Schooner Mayflower Associates announced plans to create an even faster racing fisherman. They had issued 200 shares, and in no time they were subscribed by fishing, commercial, and yachting enthusiasts, all from all around Massachusetts Bay. Mayflower, like Bluenose, would go out as a salt banker. And her designer, W. Sterling Burgess, who was himself an established naval architect, but who had designed his first racing schooner in 1905, 15 years earlier, planned for a vessel that would in every way be a match for Bluenose. The Nova Scotia vessel would face a staunch challenger, and from the earliest accounts, written accounts coming from Canada, The Canadians had little confidence that Bluenose could defeat Mayflower. Mayflower's owners expected to take on all comers, and it seemed likely that a Boston vessel, not one from Gloucester, would defend New England's honor. This troubled the people of Gloucester, and to quote the Board of Trade, a great opportunity will be missed if this international series are not capitalized in the fullest degree to the benefit of our leading industry. But there seemed little Gloucester could do. None of her existing vessels would be a match for Mayflower. And here's where the foolishness began. The Halifax Organizing Committee had not designed Bluenose to lose, and the Gloucester Committee was not disposed to having a Boston defender. For Nova Scotia, it was imperative that a Lunenburg craft win back the cup. It was a matter of pride, of national honor. And as the year unfolded, the committee went to extraordinary lengths to find reasons to disqualify Mayflower. In terms of design and purpose, both Bluenose and Mayflower were configured to speed. They were special fishing schooners, not typical commercial craft. And for some old-time salts in Nova Scotia and Gloucester, they were critical of these vessels made for speed and not committed to commercial viability. In fact, without the race, there can be no doubt, Bluenose and Mayflower would never have seen the light of day. The old salts were really right. But both disagreed, but others disagreed, judging Bluenose and Mayflower to be the finest commercial fishermen ever launched. Both vessels met the conditions specified by the Nova Scotians in what they call the deed of gift. They were innovative, practical, commercial fishing craft. They were large, true banks fishermen. The principal innovation was refinement and design to increase their speed and employees of wind. Although there was little commercial advantage for salt bankers to return to port a few days earlier, the wish for speed harkened back to the 1860s. This was a 60-year fascination. As early as 1921, when Mayflower was still a dream on paper, the Halifax trustees poured over the deed of gift, looking for any reason to disqualify her. They found Rule 5. They thought they had found it. They wrote to the Gloucester Committee saying that in their view, Mayflower cannot possibly be to sea by April 30th. She would not be ready to begin what the Lunenburgs considered their standard salt bank season that began on that day, which stretched from May to September. Thus, she would not be eligible to compete in the fall race. Many in the Gloucester Committee would be happy to see Mayflower disqualified. Yet if Mayflower had been a Gloucester craft, the community would have insisted that she enter the race, even if she missed the deadline by a few days or a few weeks. The Halifax trustees would never have received the message that if they ruled against Mayflower, no one in Gloucester would object. Thus, the trustees believed the race was not in danger. There would be an unspoken alliance between the trustees and the Gloucester Committee. The Gloucester Committee, holding the cup as champion of the previous year's race, would put it up against Bluenose, even if the trustees disqualified Mayflower. But in the real world, on May 25th, with Mayflower's ribs barely in place, the employees at the James shipyard in Essex were working 6 days a week from sunup to sundown. In a triumphant telegram to the trustees, the Boston Syndicate announced that Mayflower met all the technical terms of the deed of gift and to meet the time specified. In their view, Mayflower would prove to be a true champion. She was huge, at 132 foot long, 112 at the waterline. She had a 12-foot depth. Meanwhile, at the Smith and Woolen shipyard in Lunenburg, Bluenose was a week or more ahead of Mayflower. Locals took to calling her the Big Ark, and she gave away nothing in size to the Boston schooner. She was 130 feet long, 110 at the waterline, and 11-foot depth. On March 24th, the James crew chief announced that they expected to launch the Boston fishermen by April 12th, and Captain Henry Larkin promised to have Mayflower off to the fishing grounds before the April 30 deadline, and he kept his word. It was then that the Nova Scotians took the next line. They started to describe Bluenose as a staunch, real fisherman, while saying in the same breath that no one could say the same for the schooner Mayflower. They called the Boston vessel a freak, while in Gloucester, the local paper started to call her a camouflage yacht. After all, her stern was yacht-like. On April 25th, Mayflower left on her first saltback trip, days before the deadline, sailing north of the Magdalen Islands. Mayflower silently defeated the newly launched schooner L.A. Dutton, which you can see down in Connecticut, still exists, in a match race from Gloucester to Shelburne. And Captain Larkin continued to race the Mayflower from one Nova Scotian port to the next. And for 8 weeks, beat every vessel, American, Canadian, everyone that he crossed on the fishing grounds. Word spread quickly. No one could beat Mayflower. If there had been any doubt in Halifax, there was none now. The intent was clear. They would exclude Mayflower from the fall's international fishing race. The racing interests in Halifax and in Gloucester were of one mind. They had to prevent the trophy and the national and international recognition from going to Boston, and they reacted with a vengeance. Mayflower returned from her first trip on July 15th, and things got even uglier. The managing director of the Mayflower Association charged that the Gloucester interests had been doing their utmost over the summer to discredit his craft. He accused Gloucester interests of spreading false claims, saying Mayflower was owned by millionaires and had been constructed according to had not been constructed according to the specification of the deed of gift. The simple repetition of such lies gives them credence. I think that sounds familiar in our troubled times today. Mayflower returned to Gloucester from a second saltback trip on September 13, landing 180,000 pounds of salt fish and ready to race. 2 days later, the American Racing Committee did something that seemed strange. They declared Mayflower as the defender of the trophy. They scheduled no elimination race, but no Gloucester schooner would contest the best fisherman of the North Atlantic. But it was a charade, orchestrated in full knowledge of how the Halifax trustees would respond. Gloucester was not about to lose the publicity of an elimination race. The day after the Mayflower was declared the defender, the Halifax International Committee sent a telegram to Gloucester saying the Mayflower was not a practical fisherman. This vessel that had just brought in 180,000 pounds of salt cod was not a practical fisherman. It was not eligible for the international race. In nominating Mayflower, the Gloucester-based American Committee had provided the Nova Scotian with the opportunity to exclude her from the race. The Nova Scotian had responded, and the position was final. Now everyone in Gloucester could go on with the main game of selecting a local defender. One of the port's old true fishing schooners, but not Esperanto because she had gone down earlier in the year. It was not a bad aim, but the American Committee had lost its honor in 1921. 5 vessels entered the elimination race, and the schooner Elsie, with Captain Welch once again at the helm, won the trial and sailed to Halifax to defend the cup against Blue Nose, who would prove the victor over 7 other traditional Nova Scotian craft in a Halifax elimination race. On the 22nd of October, Blue Nose defeated Elsie by 10 minutes off Halifax in race 1 of the 2 race series. Spin forward 2 days, guess what happens again? Blue Nose outsailed the Gloucester vessel. Elsie, on the other hand, was a superb traditional fishing craft. There's nothing bad with Elsie, but she never stood a chance against the new, much larger breed of racing schooners designed for the international race. In racing with any kind of wind, the larger vessel always wins, as Captain Welch noted. He said Elsie was a good vessel. She was really as good as Blue Nose, but she was smaller. Blue Nose 130 feet, Elsie 106. Blue Nose had a net sail area of 10,000 square feet, Elsie 8,500 square feet. Nova Scotians had achieved their goal. The international trophy was the first time in Canadian hands, and her image still appears on Canadian coinage. Nevertheless, at the time, all honorable, fair judges, and there weren't a lot of them, but there were some, recognized the race had been flawed. Only one vessel that should have won. It would have been Mayflower. No question, she would have been beaten Blue Nose. But no matter, the race was coming to Gloucester in 1922. It was time to win back the cup, and 2 Gloucester groups announced They would now construct special vessels for the coming year, the Puritan and the Henry Ford. And if you think the foolishness of 1921 is hard to believe, you've heard nothing yet. Leading the Puritan syndicate and skippering the vessel was Captain Jeffrey Thomas, the man who constructed, launched, and skippered our very schooner adventure. He's an unusual man. I followed him for a long time in my book. Puritan would be 149 tons, 124 feet long. She'd be a good match for Bluenose. She was launched in March. She went to the banks as a halibut fisherman. W. Sterling Burgess, the designer of Mayflower, designed Puritan. And he came up with a plan that on paper was better, faster than Mayflower, or given the vessel the bearings of a bank schooner that Nova Scotians could not reject. By the end of November, the Gloucester syndicate and Henry Ford announced the specifics of their racing vessel, a vessel to be skippered by the great Gloucester skipper Clayton Morrissey. She was being built with financial support from fishing and other Cape Ann interests, including deep-pocketed people on Eastern Point. But let me tell you, even though she was called the Henry Ford, Ford put no money into it. They just used his name. She was designed by the great skipper, the great designer of vessels, Thomas McManus. She was a salt banker. She was also designed about speed, and she was about the same size as Puritan, 122 feet, which, by the way, is the length of a schooner adventure. In March, Puritan was launched. Though somewhat smaller than Mayflower, Olsson saw little difference between the two craft. She looked like an old fine-time fishing schooner, and the Gloucester trustees would never, never say that she was not a fisherman, nor would Gloucester have accepted her exclusion. On April 7th, Puritan pulled out at Gloucester's Parkhurst Railways, and many in the community came down to take a peek. She had a very sleek hull, like Bluenose, a very different hull than you'd see, for example, on Schooner Adventure. From Duncan Street, there was a fine view of the raising spars and fine rigging of the new schooner, her topmast stood high in the sky, rising above all the neighboring rooftops. 4 days later, a second crowd came to Essex to watch as the Henry Ford slid up from the ways, gliding effortlessly into the Essex River. But as she was being towed to Gloucester, she ran aground in the river and would not get to sea by the May 1 deadline. When the Ford finally arrived in Gloucester, Puritan was leaving on a trial trip. Breeze was light, and Puritan effortlessly pulled away from the converted subchaser that had accompanied it off the Eastern Point. Puritan was a special vessel. On April 18th, left on a maiden halibut trip. She headed to Edgartown to bait up. This was an unusual. Gloucester vessels would bait up in different places, quite often down the Cape. And now she's down in Edgartown, and from there she was to sail north to the Scotian banks off in Nova Scotia. But the fog set heavily over Cape Cod, and Puritan and Mayflower found themselves tied side by side in Provincetown, waiting for the weather to clear. The skippers talked. The men on the two vessels exchanged glances over the two speedy, newly designed schooners. And then it happened. It was unavoidable. There was to be a match race off Provincetown. The Mayflower had taken all contenders last year and were on the grounds. Now it was Puritan, Captain Jeff Thomas. And Thomas never shied away from a contest. They waited for the weather to clear and the wind to fill in. When all was set, the two vessels left the harbor. The race was on. All the crews set the sails, and the skipper stood at the helm. And then, lo and behold, Puritan pulled away. Her speed was unquestioned. She was the new queen of the American fleet. Now, for the one and only time in Mayflower's history as a fishing vessel, she lost the match race on the grounds. America had a new champion, and as anyone in Gloucester would tell you, there was nothing the Halifax trustees could do about it. Sailing north, Puritan made Boothbay, Maine in 5 hours, covering the distance at a remarkable 14.5 knots an hour, and that with only a normal breeze of wind. It was nothing for this great schooner to reel off 15 knots. She was a flying fool. She was at her best in heavy winds, but any breeze would do. Puritan arrived back in Gloucester on May 9th after selling her 25,000-pound fare of halibut in Boston. Privately, Thomas said she was a tricky vessel to sail, a true demon of speed. She couldn't be held back. Mayflower, Bluenose, made no difference. No one could take Puritan. On a second trip, Puritan sailed to the Scotian banks in search of halibut. As she did, the Henry Ford sat tied at the Gloucester wharves, awaiting a ruling from the assurance underwriters following the vessel's grounding in the Essex River. Not until May 27th, 21 days after the trustees had stayed the set, did the crew from Marion Cooney's Law bend on her sails. And it wasn't until June 2nd, with the insurance issues all settled, that Henry Ford was away on her maiden salt bag trip to the Grand Banks off of Newfoundland. Puritan returned from a second trip on June 10th, and in Thomas' word, he had vessels that would show them a thing or two. There ought to be some fun in the fall. Puritan refit on June 17th, sailed on a third trip. 1 week later, on June 23rd, word came from the Ford that she had landed her first fear at North Sydney, Cape Breton Island. 1 day later, there came news that shocked the community. Puritan had been lost on the northward spar on Sable Island. She went down at 7:30 in the evening in a heavy fog and a stiff, southerly breeze. With heavy swells and treacherous breakers, the men were just about to make a sounding when she hit. She was going about 9 or 10 knots at the time, and Captain Thomas was unaware that he was anywhere near the Sable Island bar. The speed of his vessel had carried her far ahead of the course he had set at the timeline he had set. Heavy seas washed over the vessel, and all she knew she was lost. When she struck, Puritan had been under mainsail, foresail, and both topsails, and in minutes, the cabin floor was awash with water. Puritan was gone. She would not be the one to defeat Bluenose, and the chairman of the American Committee appointed a subgroup to secure information on an entrance for review by the Halifax trustees. One contestant would be the schooner Elizabeth Howard, a men's older vessel that had just been renamed and had come up from New York. Now, but she's now under the contract to Captain Ben Pine and the Marion Company. Ben Pine is going to be involved in these schooner races for the rest of the duration. On August 3rd, Captain Albert Pico sailed the Howard north on a fishing trip, meeting the terms of the deed of gift. And in early September, the trustees announced that she was qualified for the international race. As for the Henry Ford, she too would be qualified, the Halifax trustees officially waiving the rule on the date of sailing for the fishing grounds. In their words, a series of mishaps had prevented the schooner from sailing on time, and they issued the waiver. But they did this because in their mind, Ford was not going to be a serious contender for the Cup, or at least not in the same league with Puritan and Mayflower. Seen another way, had they not so ruled, they would have raised the ire of the Gloucester Committee. The American elimination race occurred in October, and on October 24th, the Ford clinched the elimination race, taking race 2 over the Elizabeth Howard and the other competitors. On the same day, Bluenose arrived in Gloucester. Bluenose and Ford were similar in size, 141 to 137 feet, and with about the same amount of canvas, 9,771 square feet, 9,522 square feet. On paper, they were two finely matched schooners. The table was now set. And in the first of the international races, of all things, Ford did the unthinkable. She beat Bluenose, having a good lead at the finish. Might the two best schooners on the North Atlantic be the Americans, Ford and Mayflower? But events soon turned ugly as a series of non-race issues were to surface. Strange events ruled the day. And our telling, let's look at these races and the stories behind them. As the participants gathered that evening to speak of the day's race, the official judges showed up and declared they had sensed that it was a light rid at the start and had tried to postpone the raid at 10:30 in the morning. But the two fishermen had good starts. They refused to turn back and, in fact, completed the race. The judges followed the craft for 3 legs, timing the progress as the schooners turned the course. But they pulled out before the last leg, assuming that Bluenose and Ford could not fit within the time limit. There's a 4.5-hour time limit for these races. But they were wrong. Ford and Bluenose did finish in the time limit, and Ford took the race. The International Race Committee, however, called it a non-race. These are yachtsmen, for they had not been present to see it end, even though everyone knew who had won the race. Captain Walters of Bluenose knew better. Ford had won, and he said that evening, if Ford won the second race, the trophy fairly belonged to the Americans. But when the time came, he reneged on this promise. Captain Morrissey, too, knew he had won the race, and he was livid. Should he refuse to go on? Should he take Captain Walters at his word and say that one more race would determine the cup? Morrissey eventually bowed to the late evening decision of the race committee. He listened to the pleading of the vessel owners and the American officials. 2 days later, Ford again defeated Bluenose. 2 races, 2 defeats. By all rights, Ford should now have won the trophy. Morrissey knew it. Walters knew it. Gloucester knew it. But Walters did not step aside. He did not raise his hand and say, "It's yours." For him, Ford's 2-race victory was not to be. He had only won 1 race. The official count was 1 race for Ford. There was to be a third race. Morrissey was incensed. He had won, and he was prepared to end the series right then and there. He told those close to him that he would take Ford out of racing and get back to fishing. He was a fishing man, a damn good one. Only after the intervention of the U.S. Secretary of the Navy, who was there to observe the race, and the renewed pleas of the deep-pocketed friends at Eastern Point, was Morrissey prevailed upon not to overhaul frail Ford and go fishing. But he would never forgive himself. He would never forgive himself. Bluenose won the next race, doing well in a heavy breeze. She then won the next race and the last, when Ford's main topmast snapped during the contest. 2 consecutive triumphs, Bluenose was declared the winner. But word soon spread that the last 2 contests had been seriously compromised. They had been won on the docks, not at sea. Nova Scotians stepped forward to claim that the Ford sail areas that somehow exceeded that allowed in the deed of gift. How else could Ford have beaten Bluenose? There was a lot of give and take, but they did remeasure, and with some prodding, Morrissey agreed. The Ford's mainsail, which she had used at sea during the whole fishing season, was now said to be too large. It stretched as she was fishing. That's all that happened. Then I was reading these silly rules in the Halifax rule book, and after 2 races, after the second race, which Ford had won, both of them, remember, they cut the sail down. They cut the goddamn sail. She went to race and again, and they remeasured between the races again, and they got more sail from her. In the process, the sail was butchered. It no longer fit on the main gaff. If you look at the pictures, you'll see that on the right vessel in the pictures. And it was useless in a good breeze of wind. It had been significantly changed. With wind in those last 2 races, Ford didn't stand a chance. In a later conversation, Gordon Thomas, the son of Jeff Thomas, who designed and launched the venture, and Harry Eustace, one of our famous fishermen of that era, met who understood the race of the vessel, described how the race had been won. Harry: "She beat the Bluenose in 2 races. That was when they should have called the race off altogether. They had them cut the sails." Gordon Thomas: "That foolish committee. Did you ever hear of a fisherman having to cut the sails?" Harry Eustace: "Not only once, but twice. They took so much cloth out of the mainsail." Gordon: "They cut from the gaff down to the boom, took strips out of her, shortened up the mainsail. Said she had too much mainsail according to the rules." Harry: "She was fishing with those sails for 3 or 4 months. Her sails were made to go fishing. It was a fisherman's race." Gordon: "Crazy cutting the sails. For God's sakes, fishermen aren't like that. They're not yachtsmen." Yet racing remained on the minds of the Gloucester community. The following year, 1923, was to be the 300th anniversary of the city, and Sir Thomas Lipton of America's Cup Yachting Fair offered a cup for the fishermen's race, and it was to become one of the major events of the celebration of almost 100 years ago. There was also word that Gloucester would have a new racing schooner, the Columbia. She was a true beautiful vessel. Captain Ben Pine and Mary Jane Cooner commissioned Burgess and Payne to design her. She was to be 108 foot at the waterline, just 3 more than that of Purity, an overlength length of about 104 feet. Her mast was somewhat shorter than Puritan's, with longer booms and gaffs, but like Puritan, she was to be a practical fisherman. Ben Pine was determined to bring the cup back to Gloucester. You can see a replica of that beautiful vessel when she comes up for the schooner races in Gloucester. There is a replica. But now we're going beyond my talk. In Alone at Sea, I described the races that followed between Columbia and Bluenose and other vessels. And once again, foolishness ruled the day. As for Gloucester, by 1923, the post-war depression had ended. The fisheries were once more prospered, and America was about to go into the roaring 20s. With that, I end my talk. Thank you for listening. Back to you, Ken.
Yes, thanks. And yeah, folks have questions that they'd like to ask or pose to John, just unmute yourself. Hey there, Bill Barton, I recognize you and you have the floor.
All right, thank you, Ken. John, I'm just curious, you talk about part of the impetus for the races was kind of an economic thing in the industry to spur some interest and maybe some business. Did the races draw a lot of attention? Did it impact things economically for the fisheries at all?
The first half of your question is correct. It was this was a time in newspapers. The newspapers all over Canada and the U.S. Carried accounts of these races. You'll find them in New York papers and in Toronto papers. I mean, the preparatory races, the trial races, and the final races, they were good accounts, and I was able to draw on a lot of that material. It made absolutely no difference economically. It only as the economy shifted, as we grew out of the 2-year real significant depression that we had in this period, did we begin to change. And the fisheries of the 1920s after that were quite good in Gloucester and in Canada.
Thank you.
Yes, if other questions are out there, please come forward with them.
Hey, John, that was great. I missed the start. This is Steve. Were you paraphrasing what was in your book? Because I remember reading it in your book.
Yeah, this comes from my book. This is my view. This is my history from the book. There are about 4 accounts of these races that you will find that are good accounts. Mine's one of them. And each of us addressed them a little bit differently. But there's no question about that this had an economic motivation to get the races going. When I talk to people in Canada, they have no idea of all the funniness that went on between the Canadians and the Americans in each of the races once Bluenose existed. They never heard of Mayflower. They never heard of Henry Ford. They never heard of what went on with Columbia, with she's sitting in off of Halifax, and when there should have been a last final race, Captain Walters takes his vessel back to Lunenburg rather than to race the Columbia. A lot of crazy things happen, and no Canadian knows that. There is now some recognition that there was later a race that was won by a Gloucester vessel against Bluenose. So they do officially admit that. But that's only in the last 5 or so years they even admitted that. Very strange memory of the race. Great national prestige, obviously, but a strange memory of the race. And so what was a great fisherman? Real fishermen always sail the vessel, the real skippers, real men. That part was always true. And the foolishness in the race between Ford and Bluenose really comes out. I mean, these were fishermen, and they really hated the yachtsmen and all the yachtsmen rules. They had to live with some of them because of the nature of it. But it really galled them that happened. And it galled Walters in that first evening. He understood what should have happened. He made a statement about what should have happened, but I'm sure the owners of the vessel, etc., they all got together and said, no, we're not doing that. Captain Morrissey should have just simply refitted his vessel, taken down the topmast, refitted his vessel, put on the dories, brought on the gear, and gone fishing. That would have been a great story. But those Eastern Point people who put the money up would never have let him do it. He made a mistake. And then the interesting thing, he went out the next season and is still with that same mainsail that was cut. And the people of Gloucester were so sympathetic, they took up a collection and bought him a new mainsail.
And John, so was that what was the last year that the competition took place? And
It goes into the 30s. It gets delayed. You'll see the races go into the 30s. It's over a decade, and there's a whole series of races. But in my mind, in this series of races, it gets up to Columbia. It's very interesting because she was ready to face down and win that third race, and Walters wouldn't do it. And the next year, he's challenging them and challenged them. He sails up there and says, come out, meet me, and they just wouldn't do it. And he was determined that fall to race them. And then that summer, his vessel was hit by a hurricane. And in fishing, the whole crew is from Nova Scotia. And the vessel is lost off in Nova Scotia. The owner of the vessel doesn't know it for about a month. He thinks she made it. There's reports that other vessels saw her, but she's lost in a hurricane. A lot of these vessels are lost in very strange ways.
And so today we still have, but we have the Esperanto Cup, yes, still?
I think it's named after the right vessel. That was a true fisherman's race with two fishermen. And I think the others could have been true fishermen's races if Gloucester and Lunenburg had let Mayflower run. And if the craziness hadn't happened with Ford, maybe the Nova Scotians would have made a new vessel to compete against the Ford. But it never happened. Never happened.
So I assume we're not going to see a fishing schooner on the Currency anytime soon.
No. But so a couple of years ago in the schooner race, Ford and not Ford, Blue Nose and Columbia were both here. Columbia sails with us, and the first year Columbia was here, Captain Stefan can tell you, we're sailing up to the start line. I think we broke first and everything. Blue Nose off Columbia's off Magnolia somewhere, maybe Manchester. I'm not sure. We look, we can't see her. We're leading, going down that first leg. All of a sudden, Columbia comes up next to us and passes us like when we're standing still. And you understand the speed of these newly designed schooners. And a couple of years later, Blue Nose is not allowed to race. That's part of the conditions that the Nova Scotians have. But sitting on the horizon out there are Columbia and Blue Nose, and they're sitting out there. And it sort of reminded me of the race between the Mayflower and the Puritan down off Edgartown. They're just sitting there. And I'm looking and I'm taking pictures with my long lens. All of a sudden I notice those two bastards decided to race one another. And they're going like this. And all of a sudden, guess which vessel pulled ahead? Columbia. She clearly was in that wind with, they had all their topmasts up. She was clearly faster than Blue Nose, and I just laughed to myself. I saw it. Some other people saw it. And those of us who knew the history chuckled. Of course, that's the third Blue Nose, and that's the second Columbia, so then they're not the originals.
Are there any other
Hey,
questions?
John, there was an article, they dredged up either Columbia or Mayflower off Sable Island. Which was it? I mean, they had it up above the surface long enough to read the name.
Columbia.
This is about.
No, wait a minute. When the original Columbia went down, that fall later, a fishing, and this is not unusual, a fishing vessel brought her up. And there was Columbia. And then they let her go back down with all the.
Okay.
So you're talking about Columbia. That was very sad. Nobody ever brought Puritan back. She went down and that was it. I have a superb model of Puritan. Anyone want to come up to my house to see it?
Yeah.
Be glad to. Drinks as well? Yes, I don't know.
Yeah, but I drink water only, so.
Are there other questions out there for John? Yes, I recognize you, Mr. Appleton.
Hi, John. Long time no see.
You need to unmute yourself. You have to, yes.
I don't have a, but I just want to thank John Morris so much for his enthusiasm in creating all this tension during this lecture. I really, really appreciate that because it tells me the story and gives me the feel of it. And I thank him so much. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Very kind words.
Yeah, yeah.
Yes, well, I thank you too, John. And if there aren't any further questions, I just want to, yes, oh yes, we have something in the chat box here. Yes, well, I do want to thank everybody tonight, and I also want to thank folks for their continued support to keep Adventure afloat. I would like to take a moment to pass the baton to Bill Barton, who I understand will be leading our next virtual presentation. Bill, can you just unmute yourself? And
Sure.
Is that a true rumor?
Yes, it's more than a rumor. November 17th, so about a month from now, same time, same bat channel back here. And I'm actually part of a team with Dan Finnemore from the Peabody Essex Museum that has undertaken the first ever archaeological investigations on Sable Island. And you heard John mention Sable Island a couple times this evening. It's about 180 miles southeast of Halifax, and it sits kind of plunk in the middle of all those fishing banks between George's Bank and all the way running up to the Grand Banks of Newfoundland. And its nickname is the Graveyard of the Atlantic, and we now have documented through period documentation over 300 vessels that were lost there. And some of those were Gloucester vessels. So we're going to bring some of the history of Sable back to Gloucester. John tonight talked about Esperanto, Puritan, Columbia. They all were lost around Sable. He mentioned the Elizabeth Howard. She lost 4 men overboard off of Sable. So it plays into the fishery, and it plays into Gloucester's history as well. And we're also going to take a bit of a look at the amazing wildlife of the island. It's about a 21-mile long crescent with wild horses, amazing bird life, seals. And it is an interesting look at the island that tells us about the health of the oceans and the interplay of some of the ocean's life that impacts the cod fishery. So I hope you'll join me a month from now with a look at Sable Island.
That date again is
Tuesday, November 17th. And I think at 5:45 there'll be another chance to chat with everybody, and at 6 o'clock. I think you'll enjoy it. I've made 4 trips to the island, all by vessel, sailing out of Manchester, Massachusetts, and to do this work. So it should be fun.
Great.
Well, thank you in advance. And John, want to thank you again for your presentation. Really appreciate it, and just thank everybody for joining us tonight and for your continued support. So I bid everybody a fond adieu, and we'll see you all later in the story.
Bye-bye. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks, John.
Thank you, John.
Yeah, thank you,
Thank you.
John. It was wonderful. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, John.
Yeah,
Thanks, John.
very, very good. Yeah, very interesting. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.